This is the tip of the week, and it concerns binding off. And this is a swatch where the bound off has been done properly. Notice that the top is as elastic as the bottom, the cast on edge, and that the last stitch of the bind off isn't stretched out. Now on this one, notice that the bind off is tight, it's pulling in at the top, it's not elastic, it's stiff, and that the last stitch is very large. Now, I'm a firm believer when it comes to knitting to prevent things from happening rather than fixing them after the fact. And there's a way that you can bind off so that you don't get that big gloppy stitch at the end. As for the too tight bind off, just loosen up or use a larger size of needles. It's an easy fix. Now, let's look at my little swatch here. This is the row before my bind off. I'm going to purl back and then I'll be binding off knitwise. And I think about my bind off on the row before, because this is the stitch that's going to be bound off. And one of the things I can do is make it a smaller stitch to begin with so it doesn't stretch out as much. Now we know that when we purl, we normally bring the yarn over the needle. But if I want that stitch to be smaller and tighter, I can bring the yarn under the needle, which is the wrong way, tighten it up a bit, and then go ahead and purl the rest of the way across the row. Excuse my cat, George is very curious today. And here I go. Now, when I bind off, I'm going to just bind off loosely, not pull my yarn very tight. And as I go, kind of stretch it and make sure it's the same tension. And how that last stitch gets stretched out is when it is the only stitch on the needle. If the whole weight of the project is hanging, it's going to stretch it out. So one thing I do is I kind of pinch, hold that, so that it's not going to get too much weight put on it. Now notice that when I've done this, the stitch is not oriented properly on the needle, so that means I'm going to have to work it through the back. It is a smaller, tighter stitch. And so that I don't stretch it out, I'm going to just barely use my needles. I'm using just my needle tips. I'm hardly, well, except that I split the yarn. Sorry about that. I'm going to barely use my needle tips and manipulate it as little as possible until I've got it all bound off. Tighten it up, pull the yarn through, and there you go. It's not stretched out. Okay? Now, let's say the worst happens and it does get stretched out. There are two ways, I've seen two ways that people go about trying to fix this, and that is I'm going to knit, bind off, and again I'm doing it very loosely. And let's say I'm working on a heavy piece and I'm not supporting my work. Whoops, forgot I was bounding off. And the full weight of the piece gets on that stitch, and it's all nasty and icky looking now. Well, I can slip it to my right needle, and right there is a problem. Anytime you're slipping something to another needle, you run the risk of stretching it out. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and grab this little loop immediately below that stitch, and I'm going to put my stitch back on there, and I'm going to knit those two guys together. And you can see that that does make it somewhat smaller. I was kind of futzing with the yarn, so I got a little fuzzy there, but it does make it smaller. And it's not too bad. That's going to, not show up in a seam, and it will be able to pick up stitches along it, and that's not a problem. Another thing I've seen people do when they bind off, got too many needles here, is bind off regularly. And when they get to the last two stitches, knit those two together and then bind off. And the problem with that is if I were going to be picking up stitches along this edge, it's going to kind of, or seaming it, that kind of screws thing up. If it's for a scarf or something, not going to really notice it all that much. And that's the tip for the week.